Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I want to talk about Star Trek Adventures Operations Division. I love Star Trek Adventures. I rave about it all the time. The Divisions books are great. I reviewed the Command one previously. They also have a science one. This is the Operations Division. Operations is the division that covers engineering and security primarily. There's other things going on as well. Operations officers in the past, obviously any chief engineer like Geordi LaForge or Montgomery Scott. Miles O'Brien on DS9 was, I don't know if they called him a chief engineer, but he was clearly operations. Operations also includes a lot of sensor technicians. Harry Kim from Voyager was operations. And of course it includes security officers. Tasha Yar and Tuvok and those kind of people. So there's a lot to cover and a kind of a wide net because security and engineering don't seem like they have a lot to do with each other. And basically they're just the two branches that help Starfleet function. That make sure that the wheels spin and the doors are locked and the lights get turned off when everybody leaves. Like, that's operations. So, no PDF. We're going to look at this book. And so I will do my best to show things off to you. First, I have to show you this. Okay. I love this art. This art is incredible. This is just the inside front cover, and it tells such an incredible story. Not only is it just really good art in the first place, but there's obviously some kind of ancient technology, and people are trying to talk to a hologram, and the planets are blowing up around them. I love the art. Anyway, so similar to the Command book, this one's laid out in a very similar way. There is the introduction, which is just saying what I've already said. Here's what the Operations Division does. Chapter 2 goes into the Operations Division in detail. I should say it goes into portions of the Operations Division in detail. We get a big section about the Corps of Engineers, which makes sense, and we all expect that. We get a big section on Starfleet intelligence, which I think is fascinating, and that falls under security. And then we also get two more sections. One of them is fleet operations, kind of the operations version of the big fleet admiral section in the Command Division. I love the fleet admiral section in Command Division. It's one of my favorite parts of the book. The fleet operations division doesn't have the same pizzazz. There's operations is much smaller scale in a lot of ways, and so trying to expand it to a fleet level doesn't bring the same sense of wonder. There also this doesn't have the big how to run a fleet operations campaign that the Fleet Admiral thing had. Anyway, not a lot of. It's not bad. It just didn't wow me. And then the fourth section is called Section 31 because everyone in Star Trek is friggin' obsessed with Section 31. I think that it is one of the more boring aspects of the Star Trek of Starfleet. It showed up in DS9 and then it keeps getting reused. It was the entire basis of Discovery. It showed up in Picard. People just can't get enough of the shady spy side of Starfleet. And so if you love Section 31 as much as the rest of the world loves Section 31, there's a whole section on it right here. For my purposes, it was redundant. The Starfleet Intelligence section already talked about Section 31. We didn't need more of it, but it's there. What this chapter does not include is a specific look at the non-intelligence aspects of security. And I think that there are security officers who would not be considered intelligence officers. You know, where's our discussion of military police? Where's our discussion of, just kind of peacekeeping on a starbase or a starship or something like that? I guess what I'm looking for is more of the security guards and beat cops and that kind of thing. We really don't get a good look at them because we have 2 sections about the intelligence community instead of 1. Anyway, though I do think that this chapter is illuminating in a way because only 1/4 of it is about engineers, and I think most people are going to come into this book assuming that it's entirely about engineers, and it is not. Anyway, hooray! So chapter 3 then gets into the fleet operation, or the operations characters, operations division characters. If you want to make an engineer or a security officer, or even just have somebody who's kind of sort of good at those things, then this chapter is for you. And it comes with some new advice. It has some, this is actually where we do get the beat cop stuff, which I'm excited about. There's a whole sidebar here about enlisted security training. If you want a character who is just an enlisted person rather than an officer, and that their job is to, walk the beat and keep the peace, something more akin to, Constable Odo, who is not Starfleet, but you get the idea, then that's here, and that's awesome. So what it also has in here is it talks about the Mako officers, and Mako is something that we have seen in a couple of the different series. And what remember, military assault command operations. So if you want actual boots on the ground soldiers in your Star Trek campaign, this book has them. And that's more of what I was hoping for out of chapter 2 when we talked about security. But once we get into chapter 3 and they talk about character creation, that's where we get the enlisted training. That's where we get the Makos. That's where we get all this stuff. So hooray for that. Now, one of the things that I really like about this series of the Division books is that they go through each of the skills that they're talking about and kind of describe what that looks like in game terms. So, for example, if someone has a security score of 1, what does that mean as opposed to someone with a security score of 3 or a security score of 5? Like, how are they different, and what does that imply about you if you have, say, engineering 1? And so it goes into all of that here, and I think that it's great. It's some of the most useful stuff. Then they also have combinations, which I really like as well. If you are, an engineer, but also have a bunch of points in con, for example, what does that imply about you? What kind of officer are you? And in every single case, it gives examples from the shows and the movies. So, for example, we have security and con, and that points to Worf, who was, he was a helmsman when he started, and then after Yar left and he was promoted, then he became the security guy. What about Ro Laren, who was a pilot primarily, but then also worked in security. Now, alternately, what if you are security and science? Who does that relate to? And the examples it gives for that is T'Pol from the Enterprise series. She was the science officer, but she was also kind of the Vulcan liaison, and she was the first officer, and she was brought in to keep the peace, and she did have a security background. She actually worked for the Vulcan Ministry of Security. And so that's interesting. Now let's combine instead, let's look at the section on engineering. And let's say, what happens if you combine engineering and science? Who are you going to end up with? I bet you can guess. Lieutenant Commander Data. That's who their example is, which I think that's awesome. Engineering and con would be, Geordi LaForge. He was apparently one of the helmsmen before going into engineering. I did not know that. You learn something new every day. So I love this section because of the way that it provides real examples of characters with these different disciplines and different levels of skill in those disciplines. What do they look like? If you're trying to put together a character and you don't know what engineering and con would look like together, well, here's an example, and they will explain it. They'll give the game example, and then they'll give in yellow text the world example, like the in-character example, which is awesome. This section also includes a ton of new talents for both security and for engineering. So we have, martial arts is where this comes in. A lot of combat skills, ranged and melee and starship in the security section. When we get into engineering, this is when we get things like experimental device, which is one of my favorite new talents. This one basically says, you've created a thing, tell the game master what it does, and it has a wider complication range. So there's things like that. There's also one called Miracle Worker, if you really need to be a miracle worker. This section about character options, of course, also has a bunch of focuses. And the way focuses work in the game, there's not a comprehensive list of them. You can make up any focus you want. If you want to focus in on, for example, reverse engineering somebody else's technology, that could absolutely be one of your focuses. And you don't need to buy this book in order to have it, because it's not like any special rules come with it. Focuses are just a trait, essentially, that you can apply to a skill roll and say, well, because I am doing reverse engineering, I am better at this role. And the Game Master says, yes, you are. So you can make up anything you want, but I have found over the many, many times that I've taught this game to players that it is helpful to have a list of focuses. And so this book and all the other Division books include really helpful lists of focuses, including descriptions of what that might apply to. So for example, if you have imaging equipment, maybe you want to have a focus in imaging equipment, and then there's a little paragraph about what that might apply to and how that could come into play, things like that. So lots of different fun things. Most engineers will always say warp core dynamics or something like that as their focus, and so giving them a bunch of extra options expands that, and I like it a lot. So not everybody is just automatically a warp core engineer. Anyway, here we go. Chapter 4 talks about engineering devices, and this ranges from the pretty pedestrian to the fascinating. And so there's 3 sections here. The first one is tools, and some of these tools are boring. The very first paragraph in here is about cutting tools. So it's just saying, hey, there are cutting tools. You want a laser torch? Laser torch exists in Star Trek. You don't really need a book to tell you that, but it tells you that. Some of these tools are a little more interesting. When it talks about an engineering tricorder, it gives kind of specifically how that is different from medical tricorder and things like that. That's very valuable. Then, after it talks about tools for a while, there's a little section on jury-rigged devices, which is definitely going to come in handy as everyone tries to put things together that shouldn't be put together. There's a whole chunk of Starfleet systems, of starship systems. So we had the section on personal tools, tricorders and torches and so on and so on. And then there's a whole section on starship systems. How does the replicator work? And most of this is not actual rules, because in game terms, you don't need to make a roll for a replicator, right? If you fail your roll, then it gives you the wrong thing. That's not how replicators work. Most starship technology, especially in Starfleet, is designed to be as absolutely idiot-proof and plug-and-play as possible. But the engineers are the people who make it that way. And so instead of finding specific rules of how to use a replicator or a transporter or something like that, there's just 3 or 4 paragraphs per starship system describing what it does and how it works, so that you can wrap stories around it instead of mechanics around it. And I like that a lot. This goes into a lot of different things. Of course, the warp drive. Then the last little chunk of chapter 4 talks about experimental technology. And this section isn't huge, and it's mostly kind of an adventure hook type of thing. I think that there are maybe five things in here. And there's some of the famous ones, like the transwarp drive, or the Soong-type android artificial intelligence, the phasing cloak from the Pegasus. Pegasus, because it relates to both security and engineering, gets mentioned all through this book. Pegasus shows up constantly. But the phasing cloak on the Pegasus is an example of very experimental technology that you can tell a lot of stories about. And one of the reasons that I think it shows up so much in this book is because you can tell so many kinds of stories about this kind of technology. It's a great example about how an engineering problem can also be a security problem, can also be a diplomatic problem, can also be, spin off into all of these different areas, which leads us perfectly into Chapter 5. Chapter 5, as it was in Command Division, so it is in Operations Division. Chapter 5 is the best chapter, in my humble opinion. Because what Chapter 5 gets into here is using the Operations Division. And so it has the same structure as the Command Division book and the Science Division book, where it talks about red plots, yellow plots, or gold plots, it calls it. Red plots, gold plots, and blue plots. And so and then what it does is it describes what they are, and it uses the same ones in every book. So the red plots, for example, are conspiracy, diplomacy, first contact, political, show the flag, spiritual, and Starfleet JAG. Why is spiritual in there? Well, according to the description, because it didn't fit anywhere else, which is hilarious. Anyway, those are all plot lines, story archetypes that relate in some way to the Command Division. But every division book talks about all three types of plots and then relates them to their own thing. So if we're having, for example, a conspiracy, which is a red plot because it's all about diplomacy and command and kind of upper level management, how can we give that an engineering twist? Or how can we give that a security twist? And then delves down into those. So, and it has that for all of them. So there's so many different plot ideas in here, just overflowing. There are sidebars in here where it talks about episodes of the major Star Trek series that focus on security challenges or that focus on engineering challenges. And so for a game master, this chapter is just absolute gold. You can spin out entire campaigns, seasons of episodes, whatever you want to do, just from reading through all of this. You look at it has them randomized if you want. So if you're like, I don't know what I should do for my players this week, I'm just going to roll a die, and you get a 10, which says near space exploration on the blue pot list. Okay, near space exploration. I haven't really focused on my security officer in a while. Haven't really given her a good storyline. How can I turn this into that? And so then you just flip over and say, well, near space exploration, how can we, security officers may be called to one of these locations to apply their expertise to a tactical dilemma, such as an attack by hostile forces or a criminal investigation. What if there's a colony there and they're having problems? There's all of these great adventure ideas presented as comprehensively and as interestingly as possible. Chapter 5 is wonderful. So hooray for that. There's a little section also about unarmed combat, which is maybe going to come in handy to you. Then, of course, there is the same thing for security and engineering. And then at last we get to Chapter 6, which is basically the NPCs, right? These are stat lines for all of the different types of characters that you might encounter in the operations division. So a quartermaster, a transporter chief, an engineering specialist, and it gets into even kind of named characters as well. There's the generic ones like transporter specialist, but then you've got someone like Leah Brahms, who was the engineer that Geordi worked with as a hologram and then fell in love with because they did that. There's lots of different people in here, named characters from Starfleet and from the shows. And then there's, last of all, there's some Mako soldiers. So if you want to know what a Mako soldier looks like, you want to deal with them, they actually have a lot of information about the Mako soldiers. So, hooray. The end of this book, and I think Command Division was the same, the very final chapter talks about Red Alert, which is their miniatures rules system, which, full disclosure, I have not even opened, let alone read. I am not interested in the miniatures system. But it's one chapter, and it's a small chapter, and it's the end of the book, and by the time you get there, you've already read a ton of really valuable stuff about the role-playing game. So, this book is great. Star Trek Adventures is my favorite role-playing game. And every book they have put out so far just keeps bringing the hits. They are so good. Everything about them, they are full of good information. That information is presented in a way that helps spark ideas. Most of the books are actually just descriptions and world info, but presented in a way that gives you ideas of how to put together stories and how to use these characters, how to create them, how to tell stories about them and through them and for them, everything that you need for your game. So, really great stuff. Check it out. The Star Trek Adventures Operations Division. Anyway, I'm Dan Wells, and you're awesome, and I will see you later.